Lynn and Eden asked me to tell the story of Rapunzel. I'm not quite sure why. I'd certainly been called Rapunzel walking down the street before, and I thought I knew what the story was, right? What a lot of us think it is. It's about a young woman with long hair who's locked in a tower and gets rescued by a prince. And those of you who are storytellers and story lovers know that is not at all the case. So yes, I thought I knew what the story was about. I thought I knew until I had a child at the age of 44. And it wasn't until my child was grown, was an adult, that I really began to hear and listen to the story in a different way. So why am I telling it on Mother's Day? Because it's really the story of three mothers. Let me tell you a little bit about them. There was once a young couple who lived in a village. They were very happy. The only thing they wanted in their life was a child. And they kept trying until one day the woman was pregnant. She found she was pregnant. She told her husband. He was so excited. They were ecstatic. Now, for those of you who've had kids, you know what it's like when you're pregnant. You want everything to be just perfect. You want everything to be right. You want to be healthy. I took tons of multivitamins. But in those days, there were no multivitamins. Instead, there were people who grew plants and herbs. And this couple happened to live next door to an old woman. She was an old single woman who was scorned by the town. She was vilified. They called her a witch. They called her a sorceress. And no one ever got close to her. But she could garden. In her backyard, there were tons of flowers and beautiful, beautiful plants, including a plant called rampion or Rapunzel. It's full of iron. It's got flowers that are edible. The roots are edible. The leaves are edible. It's an amazing little plant. It's got a blue flower on it. And this woman, she walked to her bedroom window and looked down over the garden of her next door neighbor. And she saw growing there Rapunzel. Oh, did any of you have cravings? I was lucky. I was never as healthy or as happy in my life as I was when I was pregnant, and I had no cravings. But this woman craved greens. She craved that Rapunzel. And the more she looked at it, the more she wanted it, until she told her husband, "Husband, please, please, please get me that Rapunzel. I'll die without it." And like a lot of first-time fathers, he thought maybe it was true. Maybe she would die without it. He didn't know what to do. I mean, he would have to climb over that tall fence into his neighbor's yard, into the yard of a woman who terrified the town, and take some of that Rapunzel. But climb over that wall and take it he did. And when he brought it back to his wife, she made a lovely salad out of it. And she glowed even more than she had before. And she slept better than she had in weeks. So the next day, of course, she wanted more, and the day after that, more and more. And the husband, ever more trepidatious to climb over that wall, kept climbing, until the night when he was just about to pull up the plant, when in front of him, like that, appeared an apparition. It wasn't an apparition. It was the woman, the old woman, whose garden he was stealing from. "Don't you know who I am? Don't you know what I can do? What are you doing stealing from my garden?" And he explained to her that he had a wife at home who was pregnant, who was craving these vegetables, and she had so many of them. Could she not spare them? And she looked at him and she said, "She's craving the rampion?" Yes, she's craving the Rapunzel." "Why?" "Because she's pregnant with our first child." And the old woman said, "This is what I'll do for you. If you make me one promise, just one, I will give you all the rampion you want. Your wife can keep eating it all the time if she'd like to." And he nodded his head yes, and she said, "This is the promise. You must promise me that when your child is born, you will give that child to me." And the husband, not knowing what to do, agreed, because of course, who would ever think that someone would actually fulfill such a promise, that someone would actually take another's child? And he said yes. And he went back home with as much Rapunzel as his wife wanted to eat. And he didn't say a word, not one word about this did he say to her. Months went by, and the baby was due to come. What an amazing event. It always seems to be amazing. Most natural thing in the world. So amazing. The woman had the baby. It was a beautiful baby girl. Had hair on her head. And she and her husband looked at one another and they decided to call that baby Rapunzel because she'd eaten so much of it while she was pregnant. And oh, the joy that she felt. It was like when my son was born and I held him in my arms and I sang to him. And she whispered to her baby and she sang, "Hush, my baby, sleep, my darling, bayushki bayu, 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 bayushki bayu." And she fell asleep with that baby in her arms. No sooner was she asleep than that woman from next door appeared like that. And she said to the husband, "I've come for you to fulfill that promise. Give me your child." And the man, as if in a trance, went to his wife, who was still sleeping, and took the child from her arms and gave it to the old woman, who vanished with the baby as quickly as she had come. I can't even imagine what it was like for that woman when she woke up, to find her baby was gone, to have no recourse to getting that child back. The story doesn't tell us what happened to her or her husband. Did they stay living beside that woman who had their child? Did they move away? Did they stay together? Did she ever recover from what she had just lost? We don't know. But we do know that the old woman, as frightening as she was to most people, doted on that child. She loved children, and she always thought children would love her, but the villagers were so frightened of her they would never let her get close to their children. But now she had a child of her own, a daughter, and she could teach her things that her mother had taught her, like the value of herbs, how to grow beautiful vegetables, how to build things, how to read, how to write. She taught her at home, and she taught her well. And Rapunzel, it was the only life she knew, and this old mother was the only mother she knew. Day by day went on, the girl grew stronger and bigger, and her hair got longer and longer. And one day, when Rapunzel was 12 years old, and she was walking about in the garden, the old woman noticed somebody staring at her daughter. And she didn't like what that stare meant. Because all of us, when our children are born, want to keep our children safe. I know I did. I was willing to do anything to keep my child safe. And she felt the same way. And what she did was she made a decision when her girl was 12 that she would find a way to keep her safe. And what she did was she went out into the middle of the forest with her daughter. And in the middle of a part of the forest no one ever really came to, there was a huge tower. The tower had no door, had one window, no stairs. And she took Rapunzel with her and put her in the tower. It was a nice room. She'd furnished it nicely. She'd given her lots of books. She spent time with her daughter, left her with a lot of food and water, and said, "I'll see you tomorrow." And she left. This was a new world for Rapunzel, but she adjusted, she adapted. She loved looking out the window, watching animals, watching leaves blow in the wind, listening to the birds sing in the treetops across from her window. She almost never, in fact, she never saw anyone but her mother there. This went on for years, and Rapunzel wasn't unhappy. She certainly was lonely, but she wasn't an unhappy person. There was a prince who lived nearby who really didn't like the world of the court. He much preferred to be out in nature, riding with his horse, exploring, watching the animals. And one day he found himself in a part of the forest he'd never been to before, in the midst of which was a big tower. He thought it was odd. What had drawn him to that tower was the sound of someone singing, "Hush, my baby, sleep, my darling, bayushki bayu." He'd fallen in love with that voice and wanted to know whence it came. So when he found himself at the tower with no way in, he thought he would just stay back and observe for a while. And sure enough, he saw an old woman coming up to the base of the tower. and calling up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And Rapunzel took her braid and threw it down to the bottom. By now it was so long, it was 20 yards long and reached the ground. And the old woman, she climbed up it and into the window and had a lovely visit with her daughter, and then she left. Well, that prince was so entranced by the voice that he kept coming back day after day until one night, after the old woman had left, he was brave enough to go up to the base of that tower and call up, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And she did. And he climbed up. Rapunzel was startled to see him. She'd seen men and boys before. She'd grown up in the village. But she'd not seen anyone come to the tower except for her mother. And the young man smiled and said, "May I come in?" And she let him in. And they just stared at one another and talked and talked and talked until finally the young man said, "I think it's time I go." And she said, "Yes." He said, "I'll be back tomorrow night." And so he was. And this continued month after month. And you know what it's like with two teenagers. She was 16, he was 18. They were alone in a small room in a tower. And they talked and started to explore. And then they explored some more. One day when Rapunzel's mother came to visit her, Rapunzel said, "Mother, I don't know what's wrong. My clothes are just too tight. Look, they're cutting into my waist." And the mother looked, and sure enough, Rapunzel's waist had thickened. But it wasn't until she saw Rapunzel's breasts swelling and her swollen stomach that she knew. Now, this was a woman who had done everything to keep her child safe. This was a woman who wanted nothing untoward to happen to her child. She had done everything she could. But what had happened? "Rapunzel, what have you been doing?" "Nothing, Mother. My days are the same as always. By day you come to visit, and by night the prince visits me. I haven't left the tower." And her mother was seized by such a fury. I thought it was an irrational fury, but I remember my Methodist mother telling me about the same thing. If you ever, never come to my house again." And Rapunzel, not understanding what was happening, not even realizing she was pregnant, looked at her mother, and her mother took her by the hair, pulled that coil of braided hair in her left hand, and with her right hand took scissors and cut it off. And then, sputtering, she banished her daughter to a desert and waited for the person she knew would come next. Sure enough, she heard, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And she let down that plaited braid, and the prince climbed up. And she was looking at him, and she saw his face appear at the window, and she said, "The bird has flown the nest." And she reached out, and he, sensing what was coming, leapt for safety down below. He fell into thorn bushes, and the thorns, they cut into his eyes, and he was blinded. And now blind, he groped and wandered and looked for the woman he loved. And the story doesn't tell us about the old mother either. Did she ever regret what she had done? She had powers. Could she not bring her daughter back? No, her powers did not extend that far. And so she was left in that tower, bereft, just as the mother whose child she had taken was left bereft. And what of Rapunzel? What of Rapunzel? She was 16 and pregnant. But she was strong, she was resilient. Her mother had taught her well. She knew about herbs, she knew about plants, she knew how to look after herself. She knew how to construct a shelter for herself, and she did. She was strong, she was independent, she was fierce, like a lot of single mothers are. We work through to survive. And Rapunzel gave birth to not one, but 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl. And she loved them and held them and sang to them and looked after them. And the prince, well, he was persistent. He never gave up. He wandered for a year and a day until he heard a sound that was so familiar it made his heart leap. Oh, my baby, sleep, my darling, bayushki bayu. He heard that sound and he walked towards it, and Rapunzel saw him and called out to him, and he came and fell at her knees. They embraced. She was crying such tears of joy. They flooded his face, flooded his eyes, until his sight was restored. And together, they went back to his home. He claimed his rightful place. And you know, they say in some fairy tales, people live happily ever after. This is one of those happily ever after stories. Because Rapunzel, she got to keep her children. She got to nurture them and love them and sing to them and be loved by them, as so many of us have had the joy of doing.